When I was about 14, my mom decided it was time I start babysitting. Apparently, in her mind, it's just what teenage girls are supposed to do. So, when she heard that a coworker needed a babysitter for date night with his wife, I found myself giving up a Friday evening for the promise of $20 in refrigerator privileges. My mother drove me to their house at around 8. She practically pushed me out of the car with a promise to pick me up at 11, and I was on my way to being financially independent. It was a very nice house in one of those subdivisions where all the houses look alike but still sell for hundreds of thousands. The door was answered by a rather handsome, well-dressed gentleman who I assumed was my mother's coworker, Barry. He greeted me cheerfully, shaking my hand and leading me into the house. "Lydia is just putting Tommy down now. You probably won't hear a peep from him all night, so just enjoy yourself and try not to blow up the house up." He smiled jovially and showed me around their house while we waited for his wife. They had more living rooms than my house had bedrooms. He was just explaining how to bypass the parental controls on their humongous TV when his wife came into the room. She was beautifully dressed and looked no older than him, but there were lines around her eyes and she didn't meet my gaze. "Tommy's down for the night," she said, more to the wall than to me. Barry handed me the remote and put an arm around his wife. "Then we'd better be going if we want to make our reservations." He began to lead her to the door. I saw her glance toward the stairs, obviously nervous about leaving her son. I didn't really get it, but I figured it was just a mom thing. I reassured them that I knew how to handle the emergency situations, and I had both of their cell numbers, and Barry led his reluctant wife from the house. I have to admit, I was pretty happy to realize that the kid was going to be asleep, so I didn't really have to do anything. I went to the kitchen and put a frozen pizza in the oven. I microwaved a bag of popcorn to hold me over until it was ready, and then proceeded to the main living room again to see what was on TV. I was messing around with the surround sound system when I realized that there was something odd about all of the pictures in the room. None of them contained Tommy. I mean, I could understand the lack of toys around. It was a large house, and they probably had playrooms set up for the little guy, but the lack of pictures seemed odd. Just as I was noticing this, however, I managed to get the surround sound on, and a commercial came on the TV, nearly blowing my ears out. I grabbed the remote and mashed buttons until I managed to silence it. I was prepared to hear screams from Tommy, as the noise explosion certainly would have woken him up, but I heard nothing. That was odd. There was no way it hadn't woke him up. Maybe I just couldn't hear him in this giant house? Well, I figured I better check on him to be sure. As I was walking up the large staircase, I realized they'd not bothered to tell me what room he was in. I spotted a door with a blue dinosaur on it and figured that must be the one. Not wanting to wake him if he'd somehow slept through the noise, I very slowly and quietly opened the door. The room was dark, except a very soft nightlight on the wall opposite the door. By the dim light, I was once again overwhelmed by the luxury of everything from the built-in shelves of toys to the sleigh-style convertible crib where the boy still slept. Seeing the small form under the blankets, I was relieved. I watched him a moment by the dim light and was just about to leave when something made me hesitate. Something didn't seem right. I stepped closer to the crib. I just wanted to make sure he was okay, then I'd go back downstairs to my popcorn and movie. Another step toward the crib, another. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, but I didn't know what. As I reached the crib and stood over the sleeping form, it occurred to me. He wasn't breathing. Surely it was a trick of the light. I reached my hand down to put it on his back and feel for movement, but as my hand got closer, I realized there was no heat. A wave of panic washed over me. Something was wrong. He was dead. What had happened? Biting my lip, I reached out and touched him. What I felt under the blanket was not the body of a child. I ripped back the blanket and stared in horror at the eyes of a doll. I stifled a scream as I stepped back, confused and horrified. I quickly turned on the light and looked around the room. Was Tommy old enough to play practical jokes? Was he hiding somewhere in the room, laughing? Even as I thought it, I knew it wasn't true. My eyes raked the room. Everything was set up perfectly. There was no child playing in here. The photos that were missing from downstairs were all over this room. There were photos with Santa, family portraits, first steps, first spaghetti, all the usual firsts, but in each one there was no child, just this doll. This creepy doll that lay in the crib staring at me. I ran from the room and back downstairs where I immediately called my mom. She was confused, but she came to get me. She searched the room to make sure I wasn't mistaken somehow and that there wasn't some child hiding. It didn't take long before she came down the stairs and took me right out to the car. We just left. I realized later that what had tipped me off that something was wrong was the lack of a smell. The warm, milky smell of baby had been missing from that room. I was pretty sure no baby had ever lived there. My mom paid me the $20 herself and never sent me to babysit again. When I was a teenager, way back before the internet and cell phones, we were visiting some family, and when the adults decided to go out, I got left watching my cousins. There were 3 of them. 2 girls, age 11 and 9, and the boy, Joey, age 7. I was only 15 myself, but I generally got on well with the girls. Joey, though, he was a terror. I don't know what it was that made him that way. Maybe his parents spoiled him for being the only boy, I'm not sure. I just know he was a terror beyond what I'd ever known a kid could be. He was the kind of child who would randomly run up and hit you or bite you. If you told him to do something he'd not stomp his feet and pout, he'd just flat out ignore you. I've had many people say I should have busted his ass when he was in my care, but honestly, I couldn't hold him still long enough without getting bitten. So being put in charge of him on this occasion didn't sit well with me. I took the advice of the oldest sister and bribed him with a video game. I had brought my Game Boy with me as it had been a long drive here, and while I didn't relish the idea of letting the little bastard play with it, I hoped it would keep him quiet and out of my hair, and for a while it did. I spent the evening watching TV and playing Barbies with the girls, and he sat quietly on the couch and destroyed monsters on my Game Boy. I couldn't have been more relieved. When it started getting late and the adults hadn't come home yet, I realized it was going to be my responsibility to put him to bed. Usually, with his being the youngest, I would have expected his bedtime to be earlier than the girls, but neither he nor they said anything as the night wore on. I admit, I sort of hoped that he'd get sleepy and doze off playing and I could just put him to bed. The girls began to get tired, and around 10, they were off to brush their teeth and put their PJs on. "I guess it's getting on to bedtime," I hinted. No response. He just kept playing the game. "Aren't you getting tired? You can play some more in the morning. It'll still be here." Joey glared up at me from the game. "I'm playing now," he said, and immediately looked back at the screen. Because I hadn't wanted him to waste the batteries, I had removed them prior to letting him play, and he was running it off of the AC adapter now. Out of pure frustration, I grabbed the plug and pulled it from the wall. The electronic noises ceased immediately, and he just stared at the screen for a moment. Then, without a word, he stood up, sat the Game Boy on the couch, and left the room. I heard the bathroom sink come on and relaxed. He'd gone to brush his teeth. Within 20 minutes, he and the girls were in bed, and I was free to do what I liked. I plugged the Game Boy back in and started up one of my favorite games. Around 11:30, I heard a car pull into the driveway. It was about time they got home. Damn adults going out drinking and leaving me with these kids. Then, to my surprise, I heard a knock at the door. I paused my game and went to answer it. I peeked out the window first and saw a police officer. I went cold. Thoughts began racing through my mind of what could have happened to my parents. Shaking, I opened the door. To my surprise, out of the back seat of the car, I saw another officer pull Joey. He was handcuffed, which I thought was odd for a kid. He was also covered in blood. He even had it in his mouth. The officer asked who I was, and I explained. He asked lots of questions, and I began piecing the story together. Joey hadn't gone to bed. He had gone down the street to a neighbor's house. A boy he knew had a Game Boy system. He had knocked on the boy's window, and when the boy had opened the door, Joey had stabbed him with his pocket knife. The neighbor boy had screamed and roused his parents, who found Joey sitting on the floor playing Game Boy while their son lay bleeding. When they came near him, Joey had bitten them, and when the police came, he'd bitten them too. The police stayed and waited for the adults to get home, which wasn't much longer. My mom and I stayed with the girls while Joey's parents went to the police station. I always wondered why Joey went down the road to attack another kid. Why didn't he come after me? He knew I had a Game Boy. I was vulnerable lying there on the couch. There were no parents to come to the rescue. Maybe it was because we were cousins, or maybe in his own twisted mind he was being nice because I'd let him play the Game Boy in the first place. I don't see that side of the family much anymore. Last I heard, he was married and a great father to his children. I just hope his wife is never foolish enough to shut off the PlayStation when he's not ready to go to stop playing. This is a weird story, but I remember it like it happened yesterday, and it is totally true. I was raised out in the country. As a rule, since I was the oldest of the kids, I was always the babysitter. My mom was a single mother, had 5 kids, but went out drinking all of the time. She was also a bit of a tramp, so she was always out overnight. Very often, she didn't come back until sometime the following afternoon. On this night, I was watching the other kids when our dogs started barking. It wasn't unusual for them to bark a bit, they were dogs. But tonight, they were really barking and seemed to not be in any mood to quit. Now there was a group of boys that lived down the road, and they were known to try and cause trouble. A lot of times, my mom had to go out there and threaten them to get out of the yard. When the dog barking was going on longer than usual, I got the idea that the boys were out there tormenting the dogs or up to something. I took my oldest brother and went out to confront the boys. Of course, I didn't see any of them out there. But there was some sort of weird light coming out from the road. One of the dogs had gotten loose and was out there, so the 2 of us went out there to collect the dog and to see what was causing the light. Now the dog that was out by the road was not barking. It was standing there looking. And as we got close to it, my brother kept trying to call for it to come over to us, but he wouldn't. As we got closer, I saw the strangest thing I've ever seen in my life. It was a cow. And for some reason, it was glowing. And the dog was looking right at it. My brother ran up to the cow, obviously unafraid. He felt the cow, which just stood there. It wasn't a ghost because it was solid. But not knowing what the hell it was, I told him to grab the dog and bring it back to the house. It took me telling him a few times, but he eventually did what I told him to do. We tethered the dog and went back inside. We didn't tell the younger kids because we thought it would be scary for them. Hell, it could have been as simple as those boys putting some sort of glowy paint or something on the cow, but not knowing made it freaky to me. I knew this guy named Tony in school. I never noticed anything weird about him, to tell you the truth. I mean, he seemed just like a normal kid. He was even a bit popular, played football in high school, and got decent grades. He was blonde, in good shape, and even relatively attractive. The reason I mentioned that I never noticed anything weird about him was that in stories with obsessed men or boys, the boys are always described as being creepy or strange or some sort. Tony was pretty obsessed with me, really. He asked me out quite a few times, and I always told him no. I think it took him a long time, but he finally got the point. I guess it was difficult for a guy like him to imagine that a girl wouldn't be interested in him. And honestly, it wasn't that creepy, just persistent and annoying. The last time I remembered really talking to him was when I was talking to a few girls I hung out with in high school. They wanted me to go to the football game that night. I let them know that I couldn't. I was babysitting for a family who was going to be at the game. Tony was near us talking with some friends, and he obviously overheard us. He said he was disappointed I wouldn't be there to see him play. I told him he should focus more on winning the game and less on whether I would be there. I went back to talking to my friends. They asked who I was sitting for, and I let them know. It was a job that I loved the kids, but I really hated their dog. I told them the dog gave me the creeps, and it was hard to handle. The job would be perfect if not for the dog. The parents knew that the dog didn't like me much and vice versa, so they always put the dog outside when I was over. Well, that night was no different. I was at the house and I got the kids fed. We watched a little bit of television. I kept watching the clock, wishing that I could be at the game. The parents wouldn't be home after the game either, so I wouldn't be able to go out and celebrate what I was hoping would be a victory for us. After the kids were put to bed, and I knew the game was over, I decided to just do some homework while I watched television. It was relatively quiet. The dog, who had been fed and had water, began barking. I looked up at the clock and saw that it was nearly midnight. Although I didn't look forward to doing it, I knew I'd have to go and check on the dog. I was sure it was disturbing the peace or something to have a dog barking like that all night. With a huff, I put all my books to the side and decided to get up. I got up and was making my way over to the door when I heard the dog make the most god-awful yelping noise. It repeated this a few times. I couldn't explain to you how horrible the sound was. It was maybe the purest sound of agony I had heard in my life. I didn't know what to do, really. I was scared. I then went out to the back sliding glass door. I opened it up and there was the dog lying in its own blood on the back porch. I was certain the dog was dead. I went into the kitchen and grabbed a knife for protection. I made sure all of the doors were locked, and they were. I went to check on the children to make sure they were fine. They were. That's when I called both the parents and the police. The parents came and got there shortly after the police did. There were no signs of an attempted break-in or anything. The parents had no idea who might have wanted to kill their dog. I didn't think about it really until I talked to some of my friends. I had asked them what the game was like and what they had done afterward. We had won, of course, but my friends were a little puzzled that Tony hadn't been at the party. It was a bit weird because he was a bit of a partier, but he kept giving me these weird smiles and what I took to be knowing glances. When I finally got a chance to talk to him, he commented, "I bet that babysitting job is a lot more pleasant now." Now, I know this wasn't proof that he did anything. Pretty much everyone knew the dog got killed, especially my circle of friends. But it was still just an incredibly creepy thing to say to me.